Hey guys, so here we go with chapter 29, and we're going to be talking about World War II. So we've discussed in great length the last two chapters. In the 1920s and 30s, we saw the rise of very aggressive militaristic countries led by totalitarian dictators like Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. This chapter is going to focus on how these belligerent countries and the inability of the rest of the world to keep them in check will create the largest war the world has ever seen. Now, you see some of the pictures of it, the fighting in the Pacific, Nazi Germany again, the Holocaust, Pearl Harbor. Right, we're going to be getting into all of those. First, let's focus on the second part of the last statement that I made prior to looking at the pictures, though, and that was talking about the inability to keep these countries in check. And we're going to be talking here about appeasement. All right, now, what is appeasement? It's giving into the demands of an aggressor in order to keep the peace. Right, the analogy that I've talked about in class is, you give in to the demands of a young child who's screaming for something just to shut them up. But in the long run, that doesn't really do you any good, because then they come to associate negative behavior with positive consequences. Well, the same thing is true for totalitarian dictators like Adolf Hitler. They tried to appease him in order to keep the peace, but it didn't really work. It didn't really work too well, and we end up in World War II. Now, Hitler wasn't the only one causing problems, though. Let's recap what was going on with some of the other aggressive nations we discussed in previous chapters, starting with Japan. Remember back in chapter 27, we learned that Japan invaded Manchuria in 1939 and then fully invaded the rest of China in 1937, and it wreaked terrible devastation and committed horrible atrocities. By 1942, Japan had built up a very large empire throughout the entire Pacific. Korea, you see Manchuria up here, basically the entire the Pacific coast of China, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, almost all the way down to Australia, all these islands as well. These are going to be important when we talk about the fight against the Japanese. And when the League of Nations tried to order them to stop, Japan simply left the League. They said, all right, fine, we're out of here. And there was nothing the Western powers could do about it. Italy, under the rule of Benito Mussolini, acted out its own imperialist ambitions when it invaded Ethiopia in 1936. Now, yet again, there was nothing the League could do to stop Italy here. Here's Ethiopia, even though it's called Abyssinia. All right, we're referring to this region in here. This is what East Africa looked like in 1935 when they first invaded it. You see how there's French land, and then there was other Italian lands that they invaded from in here. And by this time, the Italians had a much more modernized military with artillery and machine guns and things like that, and they easily overran Ethiopia. Now, these two nations, along with Germany, signed the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis, and this becomes the Axis powers. Here you have the Japanese leader Hideki Tojo, here you have Mussolini, and here you have Hitler, the official signing of the powers. Now, the most noteworthy aggression is going to come from Germany. But before we get into that, let's first talk about the Spanish Civil War. Now, it might seem kind of out of place to include a discussion of a civil war in Spain when we're talking about the buildup of World War II, but it actually plays an important role in this section. So in 1936, a civil war erupts in Spain, and it was split into two sides. You had the nationalists versus the Republicans. Sometimes you also see them referred to as the loyalists. The nationalists were led by this guy, Francisco Franco. Okay, so that's him over there. He was a conservative general, so you had conservatives in here, and you also had fascists. On the other side, the Republicans, they were socialists and communists, right? So this is what the two sides were that supported each one. All right, so you got fascists versus communists, very similar to what we're seeing throughout on a larger scale on Europe of fascists versus communists. Now, both sides gained international support. Germany and Italy sent troops to back the fascists. Here you see German troops parading into Spain to cheering crowds. The Soviet Union sent troops to aid the Republicans because they wanted to help out socialists and communists. Western democracies like Britain, France, and the U.S., they officially remained neutral, but a lot of citizens from those countries did come over to volunteer to fight. And the fighting was bloody, and it cost more than 500,000 lives. And what was noteworthy about the fighting was that it was a testing ground for Germany's military. New military technologies such as planes and tanks, the Germans sent them basically to use as a field test to see how they would do. One of the most horrible moments of the war was a German air raid. Here you see the new German planes that could be used for very large-scale bombing missions. It was an air raid on the Spanish town of Guernica. German planes, they first dropped bombs on it, and then they ran strafing rounds where they would dive bomb and fire machine guns at the survivors. Nearly 1,000 civilians were killed. So that should segue us into German aggression. Germany's aggression was a series of escalating actions, meaning it kind of started out a little small and got bigger and bigger. By the mid-1930s, Hitler was in full control of Germany, and as part of his plan to bring Germany back to greatness, he, in a series of acts, violated the Treaty of Versailles. Now remember that part of the treaty was that Germany had to give up land to France and could not build up its military. By 1936, Hitler had violated both of those conditions. He had built up a powerful military. He was building up tanks. He had forced a conscription and drafted thousands of Germans into active military service, and he sent a number of these troops into this region here, okay? The Rhineland, which was a demilitarized zone. It's supposed to be like a buffer zone between France and Germany. It's supposed to be off limits for troops. Hitler said enough of that, and he sent troops in because he said this was always ours. He goes, I'm just taking back what was wrongfully taken from us because of the Treaty of Versailles. This angered the international community, but only made Hitler more popular in Germany, right? Finally, somebody in Germany was showing a backbone. Now, the first step after this, in terms of adding territory, was the Anschluss in 1938, or the Union of Germany and Austria. Okay, here's Austria. Now, Austria is very closely related to Germany in terms of culture and ethnicity. Most Austrians speak German, and Hitler himself was born there. So many Austrians actually supported this move. Western democracies made a weak statement condemning it, but they didn't do anything. Next came the annexation of the Sudetenland, right? So you look down here, you got the purple. This is the Sudetenland, kind of around the northwestern part of Czechoslovakia. Now, this area was populated mostly by German-speaking people. Czechoslovakia actually protested this move, but the Western nations were unwilling to go to war over it, so an agreement was brokered that gave Hitler what he wanted. This is another example of the Western policy of appeasement, right, that I talked about at the beginning of the video. We said before that it's a giving into the demands of an aggressor in order to keep peace, but it still begs the question, why? Why would they do this? Well, why they would allow Hitler, as well as Japan and Italy, to go unchecked, there were several reasons, among them fear of confrontation, right? Especially with growing authoritarian leaders like Adolf Hitler. These guys were becoming very, very powerful. The Great Depression had sapped the strength of Western nations like the U.S. and France, and they had no desire to get involved with international conflicts with strong men like Hitler at the time. Not while millions of people were out of work in their own countries. Plus, there was a widespread movement of pacifism. Now, pacifism is the rejection of violence and the opposition to war. The memories of World War I were still fresh in people's minds, and people were not ready to relive the horrors of that war just yet. Now, this policy of appeasement culminated in the Munich Conference. Munich is a city in Germany, and this took place in September of 1938 after Hitler had annexed areas of Czechoslovakia. Hitler was present. All right, there's Adolf there, as well as Mussolini, who kind of acted as like an MC of the whole event. And you also had leaders of France and Great Britain. This guy here, this is the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. And at Munich, the Western democracies gave in to Hitler's demands. They agreed that he could keep the Sudetenland because Hitler made them a promise that he was done taking over any more territory. So Chamberlain returns to Great Britain and assured the people there that he had achieved what we call peace for our time. And people were cheering him, and the newspapers ran headlines saying that we were going to avoid war. Not everybody agreed with this prediction, though. There was a British politician, Winston Churchill. We're going to talk more about him later in the chapter. And he did not buy Hitler's act. And he said they had to choose between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor. They will have war. Right? He's saying that it didn't matter what happened at Munich. We're going to go to war with Hitler because he's not going to stop. And it turned out that he was right. So regardless of what Hitler told everybody in Munich, we know how this is going to play out. He's not going to stop. But before he makes his next move, he needs to handle the issue of the Soviet Union. This leads us to the NaziSoviet Pact. Now, Nazi Germany and Communist Soviet Union were sworn enemies, but both realized that they weren't ready for a full-on fight with each other. So in August of 1939, both nations stunned the world by signing a non-aggression pact. Here you see the German foreign minister. Here you have Stalin kind of, beaming and happy that, this is taking place in the back. Again, it is not an alliance. That is very important. These guys did not like each other. This was satirized in this political cartoon. This is Hitler here. And this is Stalin here, right? And Hitler's saying, so the scum of the earth, I believe. And Stalin is saying, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. It was a false sign of friendship between the two. You know, they did not like each other. They still hate each other, but they were trying to put off going to war as long as they possibly could. Plus, there was another benefit with this agreement of dividing Poland between the two. You know, so Nazi Germany comes in this way, takes that part of it. Soviet Union comes in this way, takes that part of it. Poland is going to suffer tremendously during World War II, especially its Jewish population. We'll talk about that in a later section. All right, so this brings us to the actual start of the war. Important date to know, September 1st, 1939. A week after the Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed, German troops march right into Poland, okay? The swastika is flying in Poland, and it is bad news for Poland, and it's bad news for the rest of Europe. By this time, Britain and France realized that they had made a grave mistake, and Hitler would not stop taking territory, and appeasement had failed. So on September 3rd, they declare war on Germany, and the headlines, Britain declares war against Germany over Poland, France also acts, and then the rest of the dominoes are going to fall. Okay, so that brings us to the actual start of the war, and in the next session, we're going to get into the some of the early fighting, especially how the Axis countries gained an early advantage.